My name is Elias Varn, and I remember thinking, quite clearly, that the house should have smelled like rot. The road that led me there had nearly disappeared into the land, as though the earth itself had decided to swallow it whole and erase any suggestion that people once passed this way. My car had refused to go any farther long before I reached the property, and I had walked the remaining distance with a single bag slung over my shoulder, my boots sinking slightly into damp soil that had not been disturbed in years. Everything about the place suggested abandonment, and not the ordinary kind where someone leaves in a hurry and promises to return, but the deeper kind where time itself forgets to keep count. The farmhouse stood crooked against the horizon, its paint long peeled away by wind and weather, its windows dim and clouded like tired eyes that had seen too much and decided to stop looking altogether. I paused at the rusted gate, letting my hand rest on the cold metal, and I remember feeling a strange certainty that once I stepped past it, I would not leave the same man. That thought should have warned me, but I was too tired to listen to anything that sounded like caution. I pushed the gate open, and it groaned in protest, a long, aching sound that carried farther than it should have in the quiet. The yard beyond was overgrown but not wild in the way I expected. The grass was tall, yes, but it bent in subtle patterns, as though something moved through it often enough to leave paths that were not quite visible unless you knew to look for them. I told myself it was just the wind. I walked up to the front door, each step stirring a faint unease that settled deeper in my chest with every passing second. The boards of the porch creaked beneath my weight, and I noticed that the wood, though aged, did not feel as brittle as it should have been. It felt maintained. That was when I smelled it. At first, I thought it was memory playing tricks on me, because the scent was so warm and familiar that it did not belong in a place like this. It was the smell of something cooking slowly, something rich and savory, layered with herbs that had not grown wild here in decades. It drifted through the cracks of the door and wrapped itself around me in a way that felt almost welcoming. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation, but the truth was already pressing in from all sides. No one had lived here for years. I knew that as well as I knew my own name. And yet something was cooking inside. I opened the door. The hinges gave way with a reluctant sigh, and the air that greeted me was warm, impossibly warm, like stepping into a house that had been lived in only moments before. The smell intensified immediately, and I followed it without thinking, my feet moving across the wooden floor as though I had been here before and knew exactly where to go. The kitchen was at the back of the house, just as I expected, but everything else about it defied expectation entirely. There was a pot on the stove, and beneath it, a low flame flickered steadily, casting soft shadows against the walls. The contents inside bubbled gently, releasing that same rich aroma I had noticed outside, and for a moment I simply stared at it, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. I stepped closer. The heat was real. The food was real. This was not the lingering echo of something long gone, nor was it some trick of my senses brought on by exhaustion. Someone had prepared this meal recently, and someone had left it here to cook. But the house was empty. I checked every room that first day, moving from one to the next with growing urgency, opening doors that resisted slightly as though they had not been touched in years, only to find spaces that were both abandoned and not. The furniture was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it was not thick enough to suggest true neglect. There were no personal belongings, no signs of recent occupancy, and yet the house did not feel deserted. It felt paused. I returned to the kitchen eventually, drawn back by the steady, patient simmer of the pot. The smell had deepened, becoming richer, more inviting, and I realized then how hungry I was. I had not eaten properly in 2 days, and the journey had taken more out of me than I had anticipated. I told myself it would be wasteful to let the food burn. That was the first lie I told myself in that house. I found a bowl in one of the cabinets, surprisingly clean, and a spoon resting beside the stove as though it had been placed there deliberately. I hesitated only briefly before serving myself, watching the thick stew settle into the bowl with a quiet, almost satisfied motion. The first bite was warm and perfectly seasoned, as though it had been made for me specifically. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. I ate anyway. By the time I finished, the light outside had begun to fade, and I realized I would not be leaving that night. The road was too difficult to navigate in the dark, and the idea of walking back through that empty stretch of land with only my thoughts for company did not appeal to me. I convinced myself that staying was the practical choice. The house seemed to accept that decision without protest. The next morning, I woke to a silence so complete that it felt deliberate. For a moment, I lay there, trying to remember where I was, and then the events of the previous day settled back into place with an uneasy clarity. I got up slowly, half expecting to find that everything had returned to the way it should have been, that the warmth and the food and the strange sense of presence had all been part of some vivid dream. But when I stepped into the kitchen, the pot was still there. Clean. Not just empty, but washed and set aside neatly, as though someone had taken the time to care for it. I stood very still, my mind struggling to keep up with what I was seeing. I did not remember cleaning it. I did not remember doing anything after eating. I told myself I must have. That day, I decided to stay longer. It was not a decision I made all at once, but rather a gradual acceptance that settled over me as I moved through the house and the land surrounding it. There was work to be done, after all. The garden behind the house was overgrown but not beyond saving, and the tools in the shed, though old, were still usable. I began with small things. I cleaned the kitchen first, wiping down surfaces that did not seem particularly dirty, organizing cabinets that were already in order. I moved on to the other rooms, dusting and sweeping, opening windows to let in fresh air that carried the scent of the surrounding fields. It felt natural. As though I was continuing something that had already been started. But there were details that did not fit. The first time I noticed it, I was preparing vegetables for dinner. I had gathered them from the garden myself, carefully selecting what looked salvageable, and I brought them inside with the intention of starting fresh. But when I set them on the counter and turned to fetch a knife, I realized something was wrong. Several of them had already been chopped. Not all of them, and not neatly, but enough to make it clear that someone had begun the process before I arrived. I stared at them for a long time, my thoughts turning in slow, uneasy circles. I knew I had not done it. I had only just brought them inside. I told myself I must have missed it earlier. That explanation did not sit well, but I accepted it anyway. The second time, it was the footprints. I had just finished mopping the kitchen floor, an unnecessary task given its condition, but one that felt oddly important at the time. The boards were still damp when I stepped back to admire my work, the faint sheen of water catching the light from the window. And there, leading from the doorway to the stove, were a set of footprints. Wet. Fresh. I followed them with my eyes, my breath catching slightly as I realized they did not match my own. They were similar in size, but not identical, and the pattern of movement suggested a calm, unhurried walk. They stopped at the stove. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping across the empty room, and felt that same quiet certainty settle over me again. I was not alone. That night, I set a single chair at the table and ate in silence, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the house as it adjusted to the cooling air. I told myself I was imagining things, that the exhaustion and isolation were beginning to affect me in predictable ways. But when I woke the next morning, the second chair was pulled out slightly from the table. Not much, just enough to suggest that someone had used it. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, and then I did something that would have seemed unthinkable to me only days before. I pushed it back in place and said nothing. Because by then, the idea that the house was empty felt less believable than the alternative. And though I would not admit it out loud, even to myself, there was a part of me that no longer found that possibility entirely unwelcome. The routines came easily, which should have unsettled me more than it did. I woke with the light, stepped into the kitchen without hesitation, and found myself moving through tasks as though I had practiced them for years. I swept the floors, checked the stove, and stepped outside to tend to the garden, all with a quiet sense of purpose that did not feel entirely my own. It was during one of those mornings, while gathering what vegetables I could salvage, that I first noticed the path. It led uphill, narrow and partially hidden by overgrowth, winding away from the farmhouse toward a cluster of trees that stood denser than the rest of the land. I was certain I had not seen it before, and yet there it was, pressed faintly into the soil as though something, or someone, had been using it regularly. I told myself I was simply exploring. That was the second lie. The climb was steeper than it looked, and the air grew cooler as I moved beneath the trees, their branches weaving together to block out much of the sunlight. The silence there felt different, heavier, as though the world beyond that small stretch of land had been muted entirely. I followed the path without hesitation, my steps steady, my mind quiet. The cabin revealed itself slowly. It stood tucked between the trees, smaller than the farmhouse but in far better condition, its structure intact and its windows clear. There was no sign of decay, no sagging wood or broken panels, and for a moment I simply stood there, staring at it, trying to understand how something so well kept could exist so close to a place that had been abandoned for years. The door was slightly open. I approached carefully, though I could not say what I expected to find. My hand rested briefly against the wood before I pushed it inward, the motion smooth and unresisted, as though the hinges had been oiled recently. The first thing I noticed was the warmth. It wrapped around me immediately, the same impossible warmth I had felt in the farmhouse, but more contained, more deliberate. It did not feel like a lingering trace of heat, but rather something actively maintained. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Food. Fresh, prepared, and waiting. I stepped inside. The interior was simple but orderly, every item in its place, every surface clean. There was a small table near the center of the room, and on it sat a single plate, already served, the steam still rising gently from whatever had been prepared, for one person. Always one. I moved closer, my eyes scanning the room, taking in details that refused to align with reason. A chair sat pulled out slightly from the table, positioned at an angle that suggested recent use. A cup rested beside the plate, half full of water that had not yet settled. Someone had been here. Recently. I turned toward the bed. It was positioned against the far wall, simple and narrow, covered with a blanket that had been disturbed. The fabric held an impression, a shallow dip in the center, the unmistakable shape of a body that had just risen. I felt it then, sharper than before. Not fear. Something else. Recognition. As though I had stepped into a moment that was still happening, even if I could not see the person it belonged to. I stood very still, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard it. Breathing. Soft. Steady. Close. It came from directly behind me. Every part of my body went rigid, my hands tightening at my sides as I tried to steady myself. The sound was unmistakable, the slow, measured rhythm of someone standing just a few inches away, close enough that I should have felt the warmth of their presence. But I felt nothing. I turned. There was no one there. The room remained exactly as it had been, unchanged, undisturbed, empty in every visible sense. And yet the air felt occupied. I took a step back, my gaze shifting toward the table again, searching for something that could anchor me in reality, something that made sense. That was when I noticed the spoon. It rested inside a small pot near the edge of the table, its handle tilted slightly to one side. It was moving. Not much, just a faint, slow motion, as though it had been stirred moments ago and had not yet settled completely. But there was no one there to have stirred it. I watched it for longer than I should have, my thoughts unraveling quietly as I tried to hold on to something solid. The movement stopped eventually, the spoon coming to rest with a soft, final tap against the side of the pot. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I should have left. Every instinct that had carried me safely through the rest of my life should have pushed me toward the door, down the path, and away from that place entirely. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer to the table. The food was still warm. I reached out, my hand hovering briefly above the surface before I let it settle against the edge of the plate. The heat was real, steady, undeniable. I pulled the chair out the rest of the way and sat down. I do not remember deciding to do it. I only remember the feeling that followed. Not relief. Not comfort. Something quieter. Something that felt like permission. I picked up the spoon. And for the first time since arriving, I did not question who the meal had been prepared for. Because in that moment, it felt like it had always been meant for me. I began to return to the cabin after that. Not every day at first, but often enough that the path became clearer, more defined, as though it recognized my steps and adjusted itself accordingly. Each visit felt less like an intrusion and more like a continuation, a quiet extension of the routines I had already begun to build in the farmhouse below. I never saw anyone. But I stopped expecting to. Because by then, I understood something I could not quite explain. Whatever was here did not need to be seen to exist. And whatever it wanted, it was not trying to drive me away. It was waiting. By the time I realized I had stopped questioning the presence, it had already begun to answer me. The days settled into something steady and predictable, though not in any way I could explain to someone outside that place. I woke early, often before the sun had fully risen, with the quiet certainty that there were things already in motion. The house no longer felt abandoned to me, nor did it feel haunted in the way stories describe. It felt inhabited, but not in a way that demanded attention. It simply continued. I baked bread on the fourth morning without recalling when I had learned how. I remember standing at the counter, my hands moving with a confidence that did not belong to my past, kneading dough that had already been mixed to the perfect consistency. The flour was measured, the water balanced, and the yeast had already begun its quiet work. I told myself I must have prepared it earlier, though I had no memory of doing so. The thought passed quickly. The bread turned out well. It became easier after that to accept small inconsistencies as part of the rhythm. I harvested vegetables from the garden, though I often found rows already tended before I arrived. I cooked meals that seemed to anticipate my hunger, portions measured exactly, ingredients laid out in ways that required no planning. I was not alone in the work. The first time I felt it, I nearly dropped the knife. I was cutting carrots at the counter, the blade moving steadily through each piece, when something shifted. It was not a sound or a shadow, but a sensation, subtle, deliberate. My hand paused, not because I willed it, but because something else guided it. Then it moved again. Not away from me, but with me. The motion was smooth, precise, correcting the angle of the blade, adjusting the pressure. My breath caught in my throat as I watched my own hands continue the task with a level of control I knew I did not possess. I should have pulled away. Instead, I let it happen. The presence did not force me. It did not take control. It simply assisted, as though we were working together toward the same quiet goal. When the cutting was done, the sensation faded, leaving my hands exactly where they had been. I stood there for a long time after that, staring at the perfectly sliced vegetables, my mind strangely calm. It did not feel wrong. That was what unsettled me most. The reflection came next. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that stretches long across the floor and softens the edges of everything it touches. I was standing near the window, washing dishes, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the glass. But reflections do not invent people. There were two figures. One was me, exactly as I should have been, my posture slightly hunched, my hands submerged in the sink. The other stood just behind me, close enough that I should have felt them. They were not clear. Not entirely. But they were there. I did not turn around. I do not know why, even now, but something told me that turning would change it, that whatever I was seeing would vanish the moment I tried to confirm it directly. So I watched instead. The second figure did not move much. It simply stood there, aligned with me, its presence quiet and steady. For a moment, it almost looked as though it was watching the same thing I was, sharing the same space, the same task. Then the light shifted, and the reflection was gone. I finished the dishes in silence. That night, I prepared a simple meal and sat at the table, the same way I had every evening since arriving. The second chair remained there, slightly pulled out, as it had been for days now. I no longer questioned it. Halfway through the meal, I noticed something. The food in my bowl was disappearing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually, in small portions that did not match my own movements. I would take a bite, and a moment later, another portion would be gone. I set the spoon down. The movement continued. I watched, my pulse steady, my thoughts quiet, as the contents of the bowl lessened in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Someone was eating. I did not feel afraid. If anything, I felt acknowledged. I finished my meal without speaking, leaving the bowl on the table as I always did. When I returned the next morning, it was clean. That night was different. I woke suddenly, though I could not say what had pulled me from sleep. The house was silent, the air still, but something felt wrong, or perhaps not wrong. Changed. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dim light spilling in from the window, and that was when I saw it. Someone was standing in the kitchen doorway. They were still. Completely still. Their form was clearer than anything I had seen before, though not entirely solid, as though they existed somewhere between presence and absence. I could not make out details, not a face or features, but I knew they were looking at me. Watching. Not moving. Not leaving. Just there. I did not speak. I did not move. We remained like that for what felt like a long time, though it could not have been more than a few minutes. The silence stretched between us, not tense, not threatening, but heavy with something I could not name. Then, without warning, I blinked. And they were gone. The doorway was empty again, the house returning to its quiet stillness as though nothing had happened. I lay back down slowly, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my thoughts drifting in a way that felt distant and detached. When morning came, I found the kitchen warm. The stove was on. And there was food already cooking. My name is Elias Varn, and by the time I found the photograph, I had already begun to forget what it felt like to be alone. It was hidden in a drawer I could have sworn I had checked before. The wood stuck slightly as I pulled it open, as though it had not been disturbed in years, yet inside there was no dust, no decay, nothing to suggest neglect. The photograph rested neatly beneath a folded cloth, placed there with care rather than abandonment. I hesitated before picking it up. The image was faded but intact, its edges worn just enough to suggest it had been handled often. It showed a man standing in front of the farmhouse, his posture relaxed, his expression calm in a way that felt deeply familiar. He was alone. At least, that was what the photograph showed. But something about it unsettled me immediately. The angle of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head, the position of his hands, it all mirrored habits I had noticed in myself over the past few days. It was not an exact resemblance, but it was close enough to feel intentional, as though I was looking at an earlier version of a pattern that had not yet finished repeating. I turned the photograph over. There was no name. Only a single line, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Still here. I do not remember how long I stood there holding it, but I do remember the feeling that followed. Understanding. Not sudden, not sharp, but slow and inevitable, like something that had been waiting patiently for me to catch up. The presence in the house was not lost. It was not confused, nor was it trying to frighten me away. It was continuing. The routines, the meals, the quiet assistance, it was not haunting the space. It was living in it. And I had stepped into that life without realizing it. That evening, I did something different. I set the table with 2 bowls. The action felt natural, almost automatic, and I did not question it as I moved through the motions. The food was already prepared, as it often was now, the ingredients arranged in a way that required no effort on my part. I sat down. I waited. The second chair shifted slightly. Just enough to be heard. I did not look up. I did not need to. I ate slowly, aware of the subtle changes around me, the faint movement of air, the quiet sound of something that might have been breathing, or might have been nothing at all. Across from me, the second bowl began to empty, just as it had before. This time, I did not pretend not to notice. When the meal was finished, I left both bowls on the table and went to sleep without checking the rest of the house. I dreamed of hands. Not frightening hands, not reaching or grasping, but working, cutting, stirring, tending, repeating the same motions over and over with quiet precision. When I woke, the light was already high. That was unusual. I sat up quickly, a strange heaviness settling into my limbs as I tried to recall when I had gone to bed. Something felt misplaced, as though time had shifted slightly while I wasn't paying attention. I stepped into the kitchen. The table was set. 3 bowls. All used. I stared at them, my thoughts struggling to keep pace. I had only set 2. I was certain of that. A faint sound drew my attention to the doorway. Footsteps. Soft. Measured. Familiar. They moved across the floor in a rhythm I recognized immediately. My rhythm. I turned slowly, my breath catching as I watched the empty space near the counter. The movement continued. Not visible, but present. Then, before I could react, the cabinet door opened on its own. Not suddenly. Not violently. But just before I reached for it. I froze. Because I had not intended to open it. Not consciously. And yet, it had opened exactly when I would have. The realization settled in quietly. Not like fear. Not like panic. But like something final. I looked down at my hands. There was flour on them. Dough rested on the counter, already half kneaded. I did not remember starting it. Behind me, I felt it again. Close. Steady. Not watching this time. Working. With me. Or through me. I could no longer tell the difference. And as I stood there, trying to hold on to something that still belonged only to me, a single thought surfaced with unsettling clarity. The house was no longer waiting. It had already begun. And somewhere, just beyond what I could see, something that had once been alone was no longer the only one who stayed.